We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the centre of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 17th of July 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, Ukraine is undergoing its most significant government reshuffle since the start of the war, as Donald Trump threatens Putin and releases weapons to Kyiv. Is this a sign of growing closeness with Washington? Then,
the most important fundamental change since October 7, without a doubt, has been what I would describe to you as Israel's escalation dominance.
That's Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment and former Middle East negotiator with the US State Department, who talks to us about Israel's latest strikes on Syria. Now, some call it negotiation, others say it's bullying. How can countries best approach striking trade deals with the US, a country that no longer seems to play by the rules? Plus,
just be a little more fearless. Recognize that what people want to see is what you believe and that you're not afraid to stand very forcefully for those things.
We hear from Julian Gerson, who was Zoran Mundani's political director and helped him secure the Democratic nomination in the primary to be New York City's mayor. We'll have business news from the Middle East, and our fashion director Natalie Teodosi joins us to give us some insight on how Laura Weir, the British Fashion Council's newly appointed CEO, is reinvigorating the sector in the UK. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Israel has bombed Damascus, destroying part of Syria's defence ministry and striking near the presidential palace in retaliation for attacks on the Druze. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz is in London to sign a sweeping post-Brexit treaty with Keir Starmer covering defence, migration and joint weapons development. And G20 finance ministers are meeting in Durban under the cloud of Trump's sweeping new tariffs, with key figures absent and hopes for unity uncertain. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Ukraine is undergoing its most significant wartime reshuffle. Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal has stepped down, and President Zelensky has nominated his deputy, Yulia Shvyhal-Dyanka, as the country's first female prime minister. The shake-up's expected to bring changes to the defence ministry and diplomatic leadership. Meanwhile, in Washington, Donald Trump has given Putin a 50-day deadline to strike a peace deal or face harsher sanctions. He's also approved more weapons for Kyiv in a move that jars with his earlier America First stance and raises questions about what Washington really wants. Well, I'm joined now by Jenny Mathers, who's a senior lecturer in international politics at Aberystwyth University. Jenny, good to have you back on the show. Let's start with the reshuffle. Who's being moved and why at this point?
Well, there's several people being moved, actually. The most significant one is the one that you already highlighted, a new prime minister who is a former economy minister and who also has a background as an economist herself, but previously the deputy head of the presidential office. So I think this indicates Firstly, that the Zelensky is prioritizing economic knowledge and experience in his new cabinet. It clearly demonstrates that the economy is the most important thing for Ukraine going forward, whether it's the war economy to help win the war or whether it's reconstruction after the war is over. So she's a really key figure, and also the first woman prime minister that Zelensky has actually appointed. And then there are several other sort of changes also bringing to the fore people who've been in the economy ministry to more important roles. And also, of course, the current, soon-to-be former prime minister is moving into apparently the role of defense minister. So bringing that sort of oversight from overall government into a ministry which is crucial for the war, but nevertheless has been dogged with a lot of accusations of corruption and inefficiency over the years.
And meanwhile, the outgoing defence minister is tipped to be the next ambassador to Washington. How important is that role, and does it reflect a new attitude towards diplomatic relations between the two?
Well, I think it is an important role, clearly, because the ambassador is the person who is there on a daily basis in Washington, is the face of Ukraine in many respects, and is the first person to be able to sort of attend meetings and raise issues and so on. I think what it reflects is the fact that Zelensky is really pulling out all the stops. He's trying very hard to put as many faces in front of Washington that are either familiar, because the new prime minister headed the negotiations over the minerals deal recently and apparently made a very good impression on her colleagues in Washington, but also people that Trump and his administration might respect. So a former defense minister will get a certain amount of respect. So I think it's an effort to really to try and push all the levers possible to get Trump to view Ukraine and continue to view Ukraine in a more positive light.
So Trump's authorised the sale of weapons to Ukraine whilst also delivering a 50-day ultimatum to Vladimir Putin. I wonder how much leverage Trump has over Putin, and if there's any sense that Moscow's taking this 50-day deadline seriously. What is on the table, and how credible is the threat?
Well, I think the problem with Trump is he's the boy who cried wolf. So many times we have seen him, pull out the strong rhetoric and how disappointed he is with Putin and how frustrated he is and so on, running out of patience. But then when it comes to it, we don't actually get the follow through. We don't really see the harsh measures that would perhaps make the Russians sit up and take notice. So they're not really taking this terribly seriously, to be perfectly honest. It basically gives them another 50 days of, free attacks on Ukraine before they're held to any kind of account. So really, Trump's own record is standing against him here. There's just no belief in Moscow that he's really going to follow through, and this time he's really going to be tough on Putin.
And how do we square Trump's changed attitude with his America First strategy?
Well, Trump is nothing if he's not inconsistent. So there are plenty of examples of, Trump, the candidate who said, we're not going to get involved in foreign conflicts. And then Trump, the president, who cheerfully authorizes all kinds of military strikes against this target and makes threats against, Canada and Greenland and so on. So, expecting consistency from Trump is something that's bound to lead to disappointment, I think. He will spin it as best he can as America First in various ways. I mean, he could have authorized sales to Ukraine much earlier and spun that successfully as a success for American workers and military industry who will benefit from those additional orders. So he will do what he will do, and then it's up to the people watching him to decide how credible those spins really are.
And do you think that this US attitude now is a shift in doctrine or succumbing to pressure from NATO and the Pentagon?
Well, again, I am yet to be persuaded that this is a permanent shift. So what we've seen over, since January, basically, is that, it's taken a lot of work by the Ukrainians and their international allies to get Trump to move this far, which is rhetoric against Putin, claims that he's going to be tough, promises which are rather vague about what might happen that other people will have to pay for. But so far, we haven't seen the concrete results. So is it a permanent shift? I'm not sure. I think we have to wait and see, what the evidence actually shows us.
As you say, other people are going to have to pay for this. Trump's authorised it, but in fact, Europe is picking up the bill.
Yes, although there's a suggestion that they might be able to use, or they might choose to use some of the frozen sort of Russian assets as part of this plan. So, we'll see where the money comes from in the end. And there's also a further suggestion that the Europeans might sort of front load the agreement by going ahead and sending weapons to Ukraine that they already have, and then backfilling through orders to the US. So it's full of holes. It's full of questions. It's very vague. There's open to a lot of different interpretations. And so again, we just have to wait and see what actually transpires. Will it be as impressive as Trump's rhetoric suggests? Well, past performance suggests probably not.
And I mean, is this then just the same players moving into new roles in terms of the reshuffle without really any change of outcome? Or could Trump possibly, prevent World War III?
Well, of course, that would be fantastic if he could do that. I don't think we're on the verge of World War III in any case. In terms of the reshuffle, I think what Zelensky is struggling with is that he's got a limited pool of possible people that he can put in the cabinet. And indeed, he has combined some ministerial roles. And you can see that this is part of this effort to just, find competent people who could be put into them. So this is a problem for Zelensky. But yes, there is the hope that these people with more sort of economic background, with a stronger sort of sense of experience in this area, will get a handle on Ukraine's many economic challenges and the many challenges that it faces in terms of ramping up its defence industry even further to carry on this war.
Jenny, thank you very much indeed. That's Jenny Mathers there, Senior Lecturer in International Politics at Aberystwyth University. And this is The Globalist. Israel's airstrikes on Damascus yesterday were yet another demonstration of the doctrine of preemptive defence that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has developed since October the 7th, 2023. Even as the raids occurred, however, negotiations of sorts have continued in Qatar between representatives of Israel and Hamas, grasping towards a ceasefire in Gaza. Is it clear, however, that either Israel's government or what remains of Hamas actually want one? Well, Monocle's Andrew Muller spoke earlier to Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment and former Middle East negotiator with the US State Department. Andrew began by asking about Israel's latest airstrikes on Syria and whether they suggest that Netanyahu is trying to prolong the post-October the 7th war.
Look, I think the Syria issue is part of a broader set of assumptions that the Israelis have put into practice since October 7. The Israeli definition of border security, which was always based on their right to preempt and prevent, has now assumed a much more risk-ready posture. If you look at where the Israelis are operating, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria, and of course Iran, and you could even include Israeli strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen, Israelis are actually physically in the space of their adversaries. In Gaza, the Israeli presence is likely to last for an indefinite period of time. In Lebanon, the Israelis control 5 strategic high points. In Syria, I think fundamental concerns, suspicions over the Shara government, not just that it was a former affiliation of al-Qaeda, I think those concerns have faded away, but what has now taken over is the basic weakness of the government, its inability to control areas which the Israelis now believe, particularly in the wake of October 7, are more vital to their security. I think, if you ask me, the most important fundamental change since October 7, without a doubt, has been what I would describe to you as Israel's escalation dominance. The fact that Israel controls the pace, the focus, the intensity of military activities against its 3 principal adversaries, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and it can deter those adversaries from doing what Israel can now do at will, which is to escalate. So you see what is played out. And another Israeli prime minister, I worked with 5 or 6, would have by now begun to translate that escalation dominance into achievable political ends and gains. That has not happened. in large part because this is the first Israeli prime minister in the history of the country who is on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust 4 years running.
So does it strike you that Netanyahu can't see an end to this or won't see an end to this, that he thinks perpetual preemptive war is now Israel's condition?
Well, the problem is that that's a blanket statement. You'd have to sort of tether it to Netanyahu's own peculiar political situation. The government was formed in December of 2022. It is going to come to term probably in 2026. Netanyahu's predicament, I think, is that despite all of these political gains and successes, if elections were held today, Benjamin Netanyahu could not form a government. His challenge is to find some way between now and early 2026, in my judgment, to find an issue or a set of circumstances on which to run and to win another election. What are those options? Freeing all the hostages? The collapse of the Iranian regime? An Israeli-Saudi normalization agreement? A disengagement agreement?
Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has again this week restated the conventional wisdom that a two-state solution must be the ultimate endpoint. Is that still actually, do you think, a viable ambition? Is there sufficient goodwill towards that idea on any side of this equation to get us anywhere near that?
Not in what you and I would describe as, or what normal humans would describe as real time. Look, in my judgment, separation through negotiations is the only approach which offers a putative end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. October 7th demonstrated that with a terrifying clarity. Israelis and Palestinians cannot live together. But what October 7 demonstrated as well is how out of touch, out of reach, how distant the prospects of anything we were negotiating in the 90s, which would have been a Palestinian state, sovereign over its territory, coexisting in peace and security.
So just finally, Aaron, when you talk about that separation, in the near term, supposing Benjamin Netanyahu woke up tomorrow and decided he wanted to bring an end to this, what would that actually look like? If that 1990s idea of a two-state solution is no longer possible, what still is?
I mean, again, if we're talking about the current constraints on the Israeli side, and the unbelievably profound leadership vacuum which exists on the part of the Palestinians, the dysfunction of the Palestinian national movement, the horrors and tragedies of Gaza, the choice of Palestinians, which they will never get to choose because I don't see an election. On one hand, Mahmoud Abbas on one hand, or Hamas, or what's left of its leadership on the other. It's almost impossible for me to imagine any Palestinian interlocutor accepting anything that this Israeli government, or even a successor to Benjamin Netanyahu, if it's a right-of-center government, and it's most likely to be right-of-center, can't see any solution the Palestinians would accept. I'm afraid for now, and I don't know how long for now actually lasts, we're dealing with what some have called the one-state reality. You will have a dysfunctional Gaza, probably with some residual Hamas control. Horrible, terrible place, given what the Israelis have done and what Hamas has exposed their own people to. You'll have a West Bank controlled largely by Israel. No, it is a very grim and unhappy future.
That was Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment and former Middle East negotiator with the US State Department. He was speaking to Monocle's host of the Foreign Desk, Andrew Muller. Now, still to come on the programme. Our fashion director joins us to explain how London is getting its groove back. This is The Globalist.
Each of us has a craft, a calling that inspires us. Whether it's how a coffee is brewed, a chair is built, or how money is looked after. There's a love for the work, a care that compels you forward. For us at UBS, it's about designing a unique outcome for you. Because whatever your craft may be, ours is built around helping you succeed. UBS. Banking is our craft.
It's 7:19 here in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. This is The Globalist, and we're continuing now with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Paul Waldie, who's Europe correspondent at The Globe and Mail. Paul, it's always a pleasure to have you in and get your insight on the top stories. And the top story today, so fascinating, this huge scientific breakthrough, which is really going to make such a significant difference to people with hereditary diseases.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, this is all about a disease called mitochondria. It's a disease that affects the mitochondria, sort of things that are in your body that are in every single cell that we use that really provide the energy for us to keep operating. There's a pretty rare disease where that's affected, and children are born with it, and it can lead to some pretty debilitating disabilities. So this is a process that was developed out of hospitals up in Newcastle, thanks to some legislation, really it's unique in the world, that was passed in the UK back in 2015 that allowed this kind of procedure. And basically what it involves is taking the nucleus of a fertilized egg from two parents, inserting that into the embryo of a woman who doesn't have this mitochondria disease. The other woman had it, and then that leads to the birth of a child who doesn't have this genetic trait. Now, there are some issues surrounding the fact that there'll be a tiny bit of genetics from the donor mother that will be passed on through to the child. So that in a sense, there's three parents involved here, but it's so small that most experts say it really doesn't really affect. It certainly doesn't affect what the child will look like or what the child will be. That will very much reflect the two parents' genetics. So it's a fascinating development. We'll see how it works. These children were born about 5 years ago. There's 8 of them in total. They seem to be doing well. They haven't shown any signs of the disease. All of their mothers, of course, had this genetic trait, and that hasn't been passed on. So far, so good.
Mm-hmm. As you say, the legislation passed 10 years ago, babies born 5 years ago. It's been presented as a breaking news story now.
I think because they've been really wanting to see how these children develop. They wanted to assess their growth, because there was some issue about whether some of the infected or tainted or defective mitochondria had been passed on through this transference of the nucleus. And there was a little bit of a concern that maybe that might have led to some complications or some problems. A tiny bit has in some cases, but it's not enough to cause the illness.
Yeah. Now, let's have a look at your own paper, plus the Financial Times, which are both reporting on this this Japanese company and the Canadian bid to buy it. This kind of fallen through.
This is a huge, or was supposed to be, a massive merger in the convenience store world. This is a Canadian company called Couche-Tard, which operates about 16,000 stores around the world under the brand of Circle K and others. They were after the 7-Eleven chain, which of course is the world's largest, 85,000 stores around the world. It's owned by a Japanese company called 7i. Couche-Tard had made a $47 billion bid for 7i, and this was seen as a real interesting phenomenon, because in Japan this would be the largest takeover of a Japanese company ever. Usually what has happened over the years is Japanese companies buy foreign companies, not the other way around, because Japan has been seen as a pretty closed market for these kinds of takeovers. So this was seen as a real kind of breakthrough. Everybody was watching to see how this would pan out. It has not panned out well. Couche-Tard has walked away from it, saying they could get no cooperation out of 7i, that they were too difficult to deal with, and they've walked away from this. And 7i, of course, is denying all this, but it really does leave a lot of questions about whether or not Japan has gone far in opening up its markets, and whether we'll ever see another kind of takeover of this again. Now, Couche-Tard could try and go hostile and just present its offer to the shareholders and see what happens, but that seems unlikely at this point.
And is it affecting the shares of 7i?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Because, I mean, Couche-Tard was offering an all-cash bid of 20% over the traded value of their shares. So their share prices dropped substantially. And that, of course, is going to raise questions among their shareholders. Well, what do we do now? What are you going to do now, management, to get our share price back up? So they're talking about a whole bunch of different changes they want to make. But again, it raises the bigger issue here is Japan open to takeovers?
I mean, it would seem that this could be interpreted as evidence that Japan is finally opening up to the possibility of large-scale takeovers, but particularly by foreign buyers.
That was what everyone was expecting. But of course, now that it's fallen through, and what Couche-Tard is saying, the reason it's fallen through, they're saying is because 7i was so difficult to deal with. In other words, they're saying the market hasn't opened up, that really they didn't get the sense that this deal was ever going to happen, that 7i was just stonewalling them the whole way. And that, of course, doesn't bode well if there's going to be future takeover bids.
And is there any clarity on 7i's?
Well, I mean, they're denying it. They put out a press release saying, we expected this. We didn't really trust Couche-Tard anyway. And Couche-Tard has just fought back saying, no, this has been difficult all the way along. And we've had meetings, and they quoted all these meetings they had in different parts of the world where they were trying to get information. They couldn't even get basic information out of 7i. So, I mean, it got pretty nasty at the end, clearly.
Yeah. Let's have a look now to The Guardian and other papers who are all discussing this visit by the German Chancellor to the UK. Tell us what he's discussing with Sir Keir Starmer.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a fairly major event, given that Starmer seems to be really improving or trying to improve Britain's relations with the EU and with European countries. He just said, of course, Emmanuel Macron here on a state visit. Now he's got Friedrich Merz coming to talk about migration, to talk about defense, to talk about cultural ties, student visas, all kinds of things. And I think it kind of speaks to the broader issue here of the European countries maybe coming together, at least the bigger players in Europe, kind of coming together as kind of a counterbalance to Trump. And I think Starmer is now trying to take a lead role in that.
Mm-hmm. It's his first visit as Chancellor. He took office in May. That's quite a long time.
It is. I think the feeling was that first Merz was going to go to Ukraine with Starmer, with the Polish Prime Minister, with Macron, to sort of do this show of unity for Ukraine, and then he was going to come to Britain. So I don't think there's kind of this sense that he delayed coming to the UK. It was more a timing issue and more this kind of optics that they wanted to have of this show of unity for Ukraine first.
You mentioned that Macron was here, of course, and is the bigger picture here that these back-to-back agreements with Paris and Berlin suggest a light activation, as The Guardian says, of Europe's informal E3 grouping, with London, Paris and Berlin all coordinating more closely? And I mean, almost it's what Starmer swore he'd never do, which is reverse Brexit.
And I think he would maintain he's not reversing Brexit. He's trying to improve Brexit. But of course, it depends on how you come down on that issue, how you'll view all this. But yeah, I think there's no doubt that Starmer sees him, Berlin and Paris, as kind of the three most important players in Europe, and they want to bond together now. Certainly, migration is the big issue in the small boats, and that was the big topic of conversation between Macron and Starmer last time, and it's going to be a big conversation this time. They're trying to introduce more legislation, more tactics to stop the boats from coming. Germany, of course, has been a source of the boats and warehousing, and they're going to try and crack down on that kind of thing. And of course, France obviously is the border patrolling that the French police do. So Starmer's hoping to work out agreements with both of these to try and finally cut down on that. But I think, the bigger picture here is European powers coming together because they don't really see Trump as an ally anymore.
Finally, let's have a good dinosaur story. Love a dinosaur story. Right, a cetasaur. What is a cetasaur?
The certosaur, yeah, these were carnivorous dinosaurs that lived about 50 million years ago, mainly in the U.S., mainly in kind of the western plains of the U.S. This fossil was found in 1996, and then it was kind of put on display and then taken off display and sold to a private investor. Now it's been put up for sale. The initial price, Sotheby's listed it at about $4 million, $5 million. It sold for $30 million, which is kind of a sign that the fossil market, who knew, is really taking off. I mean, this is the third highest amount ever for a fossil. There were a couple other ones sold for $40 million and $31 million not that long ago. And interest in this thing was really high, apparently. We're not sure who the buyer is yet, but apparently the buyer has promised to lend it to an institution so more research can be done on it. But apparently what's unique about it is it's a fully formed juvenile certosaur, and those are incredibly rare. They've only 4 of them been found ever, and this is the most preserved one. So there is real value in it, but boy, $30 million for a fossil.
Which is extraordinary. I mean, why? What's driving this?
That's what people are trying to understand. Why? I mean, obviously they're rare. Obviously anything that's scarce will have value, but why there's such a big interest in this? I think the other two going for so much, 40 million and 30 million, have sort of fed the whole market for these things. Everybody's now taking an interest, and that might have inflated all the value. But there's real questions about, yes, this is a legitimate fossil, but what happens when the more, nefarious figures lurking in this market sort of show up and start flogging fossils that aren't? That's the real concern here. Also, there's going to be an effect on paleontologists who do digging. What are the farmers or the people who own the fields going to start charging? Are they going to see these prices and say, well, now we want to charge you more to come onto our field? So there could be some ramifications of this that might not be entirely positive.
And in fact, somebody from that Association of Applied Paleontologists Sciences is very worried about its journey because it went from museum collection to private collection.
To private hands. And I think that's the big concern, that these things, you go to museums, you see these models of these dinosaurs all over the place. Is that now going to be less and less available publicly? Are these things just going to be hidden away in some warehouse by a private investor who hopes the value goes up? That hopefully won't be the case in this particular sale, but that is a concern, yeah.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. That's Paul Waldy there from the Globe and Mail. You're with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Israel launched major airstrikes on Damascus on Wednesday, blowing up part of the defence ministry and targeting a site near the presidential palace. The strikes follow deadly sectarian violence in Suwaida and come as Israel vows to prevent Syria's new Islamist-led government from attacking the Druze minority. Friedrich Merz has arrived in London on his first visit as German Chancellor to sign a broad friendship treaty with Sir Keir Starmer. The deal strengthens UK-EU ties nearly a decade after Brexit, with pledges on defence cooperation, anti-smuggling laws and curbing illegal migration. And G20 finance ministers are meeting in South Africa, but Trump's new tariffs and a string of high-profile absences are testing the forum's relevance. With the US poised to take over the presidency next year, delegates are bracing for a scaled-back agenda and a communiqué if one can even be agreed. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. When Zoran Mamdani secured the Democratic nomination in the primary to be New York City's mayor, it stunned the American political establishment. In a matter of months, a virtually unknown state representative had skyrocketed from polling at around 1% to clinching the nomination from a household Democrat name, former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Monocle Radio's producer of the Foreign Desk, Anita Riotta, spoke with Julian Gerson, Mamdani's political director during the primary and now director of writing, on how they pulled off this political upset. She started by asking him how the campaign honed Mamdani's platform of affordability into a cohesive message and speeches that often went viral.
In many ways, speech writing is a bit of a dying art as people's attention spans shorten, and as we saw, one of the big successes of the campaign was social media and speaking directly to voters over a couple minutes and being persuasive in that sense. But I think part of why speechwriting is a dying art is because politicians don't take it seriously and don't think that there is that opportunity to kind of use this larger platform and develop rhetoric and be really intentional in that way. And Zoran does not think in that manner. He really does take it seriously. So we thought about speechwriting, we thought about just the written form as a way of telling a story and a way of being hyper-specific at the same time. I think so often when politicians try to speak in these grand platitudes and try to talk about working class values, they use kind of almost what feels like poll-tested or branded language that doesn't actually mean anything. It's not evocative. It doesn't resonate with specific voters. What we tried to do was tell a story that was one, like really illuminating with this message. And it was easy because Zoran, what defined the primary was a willingness to be out among the people and a willingness to, especially in contrast with Andrew Cuomo, who just wanted to stay inside as much as he could.
You said something there about how speechwriting might feel like a dying art. I really want to get into that because on one hand, you have to create a message, make it clear, communicate it to over 8 million New Yorkers, do so in a fractured media landscape. How do you tackle all those challenges?
Yeah, I think the greatest challenge when I think about speechwriting in the contemporary, media environment is it's not a 24-hour news cycle anymore. It's a 15-minute news cycle, and to write a good speech, first of all, it involves a significant amount of buy-in from the elected official. And so that takes time. It takes, a couple hours of reviewing it and adding input. So many of the greatest lines from the Victory Night speech were his. The Nelson Mandela quote was something that he wanted in there. And that doesn't happen if it's just a speechwriter who can understand your voice, but isn't fundamentally your voice. So I think within this fractured news cycle, this news environment, it requires a bit of patience, and it requires that you kind of set up the parameters rather than be reactive to them, if that makes sense. So luckily now we have this platform, and there's a lot of people who want to hear from Zoran, but you also have to have a certain level of self-confidence that I don't need to be the first person to say the first thing right after something has happened. I can take my time to be thoughtful. I can take my time to get my words right. And then I can trust that because there's buy-in, or just because I know I have something meaningful to say, people will listen. But it takes a fair amount of self-belief.
How do you think progressive politicians should be crafting and communicating their messages, their policies in the era of Trump? Are the tools that have made you successful sort of Mamdani specific, or could they work for a larger swath of progressives or even the broader Democratic Party?
Yeah, I don't think they are specific to us. First of all, there's been a lot of post-campaign litigation of how did this once-in-a-generation upset get pulled off? And I think there's two things that we have largely agreed on, many of those of us who were part of the campaign. One is that there was a joy that animated the race, and politics is quantitative and it is empirical, but it is also fundamentally kind of vibes-based, and that is deep in the sense that it's like, can you trust this person, right? The age-old line is this somebody I want to get a beer with? But that's deeper, right? Is this somebody who I have faith in and I can trust to be responsible for my family? Every campaign I've been on that has been successful has been one where there is a kindness that animates it. And I think that is actually deeply important if you're also trying to guide with progressive or lead with progressive values that are kind. They should inform how you campaign as well. The more important component, I would say, is policy. There's, lots of fascination, especially I think by older pundits, of like, what do young voters turn out for? What is attractive to them? And I think what made us successful was that Zoran had these three clearly defined policies that whenever he gave a speech, he would involve the audience in it by saying, we're going to, and people would scream, freeze the rent. We're going to deliver universal childcare. And so people feel invested. And that is what was defining. None of the other stuff is as important as have the actual meat, the substance of why you're running for office be clearly identifiable with you. And have those be things, ideally, hopefully if you're a progressive, that like really adhere to those values that stand to make people's lives better.
Well, as Democrats have moved into being the opposition, sort of more or less for the last decade now, how have you found their messaging to voters? What do you think is working and what do you think should not stick around?
Yeah, I think what we found with Andrew Cuomo was that we had a really clear foil, and that here's this guy who has all these terrible allegations against him, these proven track record of being a bully. And I feel that many Democrats would have shied away from that. And we said, no, let's call this out explicitly. And I think you can transpose that onto national politics, where if you're in the opposition, it's frustrating in many ways, but it's also an opportunity. You don't have to use your power to pass legislation. You don't have that chance. But what you can do is use it to really call out derelictions and, negligence and refusals to kind of stand up for people. And we see so much right now in the national landscape, and we have for years, whether it's ICE coming in and literally kidnapping our neighbors, whether it's the one big, beautiful bill that is, shocking and depriving people of the Medicaid or the SNAP benefits that they need. These are very easy things to stand in opposition to. And I think there's a natural impulse, the Democrats of this Big Tent party, to be conciliatory and inclusive, but it's not conciliatory and inclusive to tolerate those things, right? It's conciliatory and inclusive to show that you reject that and that you have no respect for those like really deeply horrific policies. So I guess my one line thing is just be a little more fearless. Like, recognize that what people want to see is what you believe, and that you're not afraid to stand very forcefully for those things. Do it, without getting horrible and mean-spirited, but do it without also cowering.
That was Gillian Gerson, Zoran Mamdani's Director of Writing, speaking to Monocle Radio's Anita Riotta. You're with Monocle Radio. 38 minutes past midnight in Mexico City, 7:38 here in London. With new US tariffs looming on August the 1st, Washington's biggest trading partners are in a bind. Some, like Mexico, have tried playing ball. Others, like Canada and the EU, have alternated between tough talk and charm. None of it seems to have worked. Kim McCrail, who's reporter for The Wall Street Journal, joins us now from Brussels to discuss her latest piece, which reports on the scramble amongst global leaders to find the right negotiating tone when dealing with Donald Trump. Kim, thanks for joining us. You lay out in your piece how countries have tried everything from boosting border security to holding off on retaliation, and yet Trump keeps turning the screws. Why is nothing getting traction?
Yeah, that's right. I think that a lot of governments, a lot of people who watch these discussions might have thought that by this point, several months into to tariffs that began and threats that have been going on, that we might have a better sense of what a good playbook for addressing this might be. And I think what we're finding is we really don't. There have been a lot of different tactics tried, and I think governments are still struggling to understand what's the right way to deal with all of this. And we're seeing, as you said, this such a wide range of approaches that have been taken, even and shifting approaches too. We've seen Canada start off with a tougher approach, tougher talk, and some counter tariffs that they put in place, and then shifting to some more of a conciliatory approach, and trying to, in some ways, appease President Trump and some of those demands.
I mean, this doesn't just look like economic pressure. It feels increasingly like political muscle flexing or indeed even bullying. What range of objectives is the administration trying to achieve with these threats?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the trickiest things, I think, for governments that are dealing with this and trying to figure out their approach, is understanding what's the reasoning behind President Trump's tariffs, and how does that apply to their particular situation? And it's tricky because there are a number of reasons that the administration and that President Trump have talked about. So for one, we've got the revenue generation that tariffs are bringing in, and President Trump and other officials have talked about what a benefit that is to the U.S. To the U.S. budget. So that's one factor. We also see some political pressure being exerted. And I think Brazil, the letter that was sent to Brazil, is probably the best example so far of that, where there were very specific political asks, specifically for an ally of President Trump in Brazil, which is a totally, I think for many countries, really just almost an unheard of use of tariff and trade pressure to try to get a government in another country to get involved in its judicial system. Then we've also got the complaints and concerns about non-tariff barriers in other countries. So a concern from the U.S. that some U.S. goods are not getting as good access to other markets as the administration believes they should, as well as the concern generally about the trade deficit for the U.S. and the desire to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. So all of those things are, I think, playing out in different ways and sometimes even at different times. So countries that are trying to respond to that are, I think, grappling with trying to understand, okay, in this particular negotiation and in my negotiation, what's the goal of the Trump administration right now, and how do I try to give them what they want to try to keep tariffs to a minimum?
So, of course, August the 1st, if we get to that point without a deal, what's the likeliest outcome? I mean, it could be that Trump once again rows back and prolongs it even more, but could there be more tariffs, more retaliation, or just more chaos?
Yeah, it's a great question. Now that we've had a couple of delays, it's hard to say how serious the August 1st deadline is. I think, we always have the possibility that President Trump decides, we need to give it a little more time, or creates a new deadline. So that could happen, and we'll see. I think different countries try to figure out how to deal with that. Do they keep on negotiating and keep on with the current level of tariffs they're experiencing right now? Then you have the possibility of, if President Trump follows through on the threats that he's made to raise tariffs to different countries in the letters that he's sent out, if that actually goes into effect on August 1st, some of those tariffs are incredibly high levels that officials in other countries and economies have said could effectively almost halt some trading flows. So the European Union, for example, has talked about 30% tariffs, which is the threat, the level that was threatened in the letter that the EU received, that could really almost stop transatlantic trade, which is a difficult idea to imagine because those trade flows are huge and so many supply chains and companies are dependent on them. So if they were to go into effect, I think what you would see from some countries, and I would say the EU would be included in that, you'd see a real reflection on, okay, what do we do in response? Do we retaliate at this point? President Trump threatened in the letters, I think, to actually go beyond the level that he said tariffs would be applied at based on any retaliation, so to actually go even higher. But that starts to raise the question for other economies of, does it even matter at that point if trade flows are almost being halted? A few more percentage points or even double the level might not make that much of a difference. So that might embolden some of them to retaliate.
Kim, fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. That's Kim McCrail, reporter for the Wall Street Journal in Brussels. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
IQ, EQ, and AI. 3 components key to the craft of innovation at UBS. Because to stay ahead in a rapidly evolving age, you need a partner with decades of experience, endless passion for the work, and a finger on the pulse of leading technologies, bridging human expertise with artificial intelligence, all to elevate you. UBS. Banking is our craft.
Now we're going to cross to Dubai to join Jumana Bashetchi, who is author of Bloomberg TV's Horizons Middle East and Africa, to bring us the latest business news from the region. Jumana, welcome to Monocle Radio.
Morning.
Let's start with Saudi Arabia, which has asked a consulting firm to conduct a strategic review on its plans for building the line. Just remind us what the line is. It's part of NEOM, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a story that my Bloomberg colleagues broke earlier this week. Saudi Arabia has indeed asked several consulting firms to conduct the strategic review of the futuristic city known as the Line. So what is the Line, for those unfamiliar? It is a very ambitious city, part of the Vision 2030 vision set out by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. It was introduced in 2017, supposed to span 170 kilometers worth of skyscrapers, all with no cars. It was supposed to be environmentally friendly and was aiming to house 1.5 million residents by 2030. Now, several years on, a lot of those ambitions have had to be scaled back. Last year, we reported that our ultimate ambition for residents has now been targeted, has been revised downwards to 300,000 residents by the end of the decade. And so ultimately, the goal of this latest initiative with the consultants is to find ways to commercialize the project and potentially downsize it as well. And also just showcases how Saudi Arabia as a whole is looking to recalibrate projects under the Vision 2030 plan as we talk about lower oil prices, weaker than projected foreign investment into the country, and ongoing budget shortfalls.
One place, though, where it seems that there is a lot of cash coming in is in Middle East startups.
Yeah, that's right. So interesting data put out by Magnet. This is a data analytics firm based in the region, and they analyze trends in VC funding, private equity. And so far, actually, they are showing that startups in the Middle East have actually doubled fundraising in the first half of the year. $1.5 billion has been raised through 310 deals. And it stands out because it bucks a trend more broadly seen around the world where VC investments have started to slow down because of macro uncertainty, tariffs, investor caution, and so forth. And in fact, the EM region as a whole actually saw a drop of around 7% through the first half of the year. So this is its weakest first half since 2017. But the Middle East stands out. The biggest growth actually was in Saudi Arabia with over $245 million worth of fund launches. The big two, Ninja raised $250 million, and then Tabi also in the UAE region up $160 million. So there has been good momentum, at least as far as VC funding is concerned.
And in terms of the startups, what kind of companies are we looking at? Is there any kind of theme or thread that runs through these things that are raising these record funds?
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been a theme for a while now, but fintech continues to attract investor interest for obvious reasons because of the growth of the non-oil economy as these countries push in to the services industry. You are seeing an explosion of payment schemes. So anything fintech related is doing quite well. AI also, so no surprise there, artificial intelligence. You also have a lot of these state-backed enterprises and initiatives that are underway, specifically in UAE and Saudi Arabia, to encourage the build out of data centers and the AI ecosystem. So any startup or business that's tangential to that is also seeing a good amount of investment. And no surprise really that on the retail side of things, you are also seeing renewed interest in the last few months, given some of these retail companies have managed to IPO at the beginning of this year, including the likes of Spinneys.
Let's just zero in on the UEA, which is seeing a renewed momentum in equity capital markets heading into the second half of the year. Tell us more.
Yeah, so as we talk about these global trends in capital markets, in general, the first couple of months of the year have been pretty subdued, and that is the case for many countries around the world. But again, the UAE is seeing some renewed momentum in these equity capital markets. Deals, the pipeline seems to be quite strong as we go into the second half of the year, and not just on IPOs, but also secondary offerings as well. So companies are going for secondary listings, or parent companies are looking to sell a part of their subsidiaries into the public. So there's a good pipeline for that. That is in contrast to Saudi Arabia, which purely from an equity capital markets perspective is citing a little bit more caution on back of some of the issues that we just spoke about, including the lower oil backdrop, the fact that there is some cautiousness. The rest of the world tends to see Saudi Arabia's economy as being quite linked to the price of oil. And they've also had a couple of IPOs that have come to the market that have not performed that well this year, including Flynas, which was the first airlines IPO in several years, and Specialized Medical Company, which have not performed that well in post-market.
I finally, can you tell us how much is regional conflict and the politics of the area affecting the markets there?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And it seems to be the case that obviously you had 12 days, you had a couple of weeks where tension was very high. People were very nervous. Investors were nervous about the outlook. But the latest numbers, the pipeline would suggest that investors are looking past that now. If anything were to show up, at least on the VC funding side, for example, which is what we spoke about, it would probably show up in the third quarter. But if you look at capital markets activity, if anything, what it's done is it's brought about pent-up demand, and that demand was looking for a home. Now there are opportunities for investors to get involved, and it looks as though, at least in the part of the UAE, capital markets do have a strong pipeline for the second half of this year, and investors are willing to look past some of the geopolitical uncertainty. And I should just say, by the way, local stock markets have completely brushed off the events of this year. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange is up 25% this year. The Egyptian Stock Exchange is up 13%.
Extraordinary. Jumana, thank you very much indeed. That's Jumana Bersecci. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now, I am joined by Monocle's fashion director, Natalie Teodosi. Natalie, we're going to talk about how London's getting its groove back. But first of all, we've got to talk about you getting your groove on, because you went to a party this week that is one of the mainstays of the British summer social season. Tell us more.
Hi, Georgina. I did. It was earlier on the week, which is not usually when I go out, but it was a really fun gathering of the London industry. So all the designers that are working here, retailers, buyers, everyone in communications. It's like a really fun get together at the Serpentine Summer Pavilion. And as I was writing in my column, I think those kind of gatherings in the past, which are organized by the British Fashion Council, people would just show up for a few minutes out of obligation without a lot of excitement. But this week, it really felt like everyone wanted to be there, and there was a lot of optimism in the air because of a lot of changes that are happening in London Fashion Week. And as you're saying, there's promise that London might get its groove back.
And a lot of this is down to Laura Weir. So she's the newly appointed CEO of the British Fashion Council. What did she say that night, which really changed opinion?
Exactly. So Laura was editor at the Evening Standard, at Vogue. So she has a lot of journalism experience, which is interesting for someone to take that CEO position from journalism. I think it hasn't really happened before. And she's been on the job for around 3 months now and spent all her time just sitting down with the designers, listening to what do they need, the kind of support that they've been lacking from the British Fashion Council for a while. So she laid out some of her plans during that evening as part of her speech, which include some very sensible steps that everyone has been talking about and needing for a while. So there will be no fees for designers who want to be part of London Fashion Week, because that was a cost that in the past they had to consider. And there's also a lot of investment in education and taking designers back to their hometowns outside of London to educate young people about the possibilities of a career in fashion, not just within the capital, but all around the UK. And another interesting one is investing in an international guest program, because we have lost out on international guests at London Fashion Week. Usually they have been choosing to skip and just fly to Milan and Paris, where everyone gathers. But there's a lot of determination now to create this program, invite people and give them incentive to come back to London. So all of that came together, and it just felt like a relief.
She talked about having conversations with government representatives from places like Hong Kong and India and the Middle East. Is the British government giving us enough support to make that happen here?
Not at all. And I think that was part of the reason why London Fashion Week and London designers have been suffering so much. There's very little support. I think now there are some new schemes, and she's really lobbying and working with the government. But what was interesting is that she did say how there are all these representatives, whether it's from the Middle East, from India, from Hong Kong, who come and speak to the British Fashion Council, and they get ideas about how London Fashion Week operates, how talent works here, because it might not be at its best now, but London Fashion Week has an incredible history and heritage of nurturing some of the best talent in the world. And these governments have been investing millions in building a fashion week, in creating a fashion industry from scratch almost, because they see the importance in what fashion and the creative industries in general can do in building a country's image. So there's hope that this will come back in the UK as well, with fresh fans and all these new schemes that will bring people to London, and also give the financial and support and the mentoring that the local designers need to be able to stay here and not have to shut shop completely, like what has been happening after Brexit for some brands, or the ones that are still going, go to Paris where there's a better crowd.
Natalie, thank you very much indeed. That was Monocle's fashion director, Natalie Teodosi. And for the full article and more from Monocle's editors and correspondents around the world, do head to monocle.com/minute. Now, that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Vincent McAviney, Tom Webb and Anita Riotta, our researcher, Henry King, and our studio manager, Elliot Greenfield. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. I'll be back with The Briefing, that's live at midday in London. And The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow. Lots of great music and sharp programming coming up, so do stay with Monocle Radio. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.